Hey guys, tonight we begin with a very simple question that becomes less simple the longer you sit with it. How did Native Americans sleep in sub-zero winter tents without freezing? Picture the scene carefully, because the modern imagination usually gets it wrong. It sees a thin cone of hide or bark standing in a white field, a little smoke leaking from the top, and then it thinks, impossible. A tent is what you take camping in July. A tent is nylon, bent poles, a zipper that jams at 2 in the morning, and a sad little sleeping bag that promises comfort until the ground begins stealing your soul through your spine. But the winter homes of Indigenous North America were not flimsy vacation shelters dropped into a hostile landscape by people hoping for the best. And there was no single Native American tent, because North America was not one place, one weather system, or one culture. A Lakota or Blackfoot family on the northern plains, an Ojibwe family in the woodlands, a Mi'kmaq household in the northeast, a Dene or Cree winter camp farther north, and Inuit communities in Arctic environments, all faced cold in different ways, with different materials, different houses, and different rules for staying alive. So tonight we are not entering a fantasy of superhuman toughness. We are entering a world where warmth had to be built. It had to be hunted, scraped, sown, carried, stacked, banked, shared, and protected. Warmth was not just a feeling inside the body, it was a system around the body. And that system began before anyone lay down. If you like these slow journeys into the ordinary lives of the past, the strange little systems people built just to survive another night, you can like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is there, because there is something quietly perfect about listening to winter history from a warm bed, while somewhere else in the world it is already morning. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand is that the cold did not attack only from above. It came from everywhere. It pressed against the shelter walls, it slipped under edges, it moved through damp clothing, it waited in the ground. The ground was the patient enemy. Even when a fire burned inside a lodge, the earth beneath a sleeping person could pull warmth away all night with the calm persistence of a tax collector waiting since sunset. That is why the answer was never just, they had a fire. Fire mattered, of course. In many shelters there was a central hearth, smoke rising toward an opening or being guided by flaps, bark edges, or the shape of the roof. But fire is a loud answer to a quiet problem. It gives light and heat. It cooks food. It also smokes your eyes, eats fuel, throws sparks, and becomes dangerous if treated like a pet instead of a tool. The real winter intelligence lived in layers. On parts of the plains, the teepee was a brilliant machine of hide, poles, air, and draft. The word itself comes through Dakota and Lakota usage, though many plains peoples used this kind of conical lodge in different forms. Historically, covers could be made from prepared bison hides, and later, after trade goods became common, canvas changed the weight and handling of the lodge without erasing the old physics. The shape shed wind. The poles made a strong skeleton. Smoke flaps at the top could be adjusted because wind direction decided whether the inside would breathe or become miserable. In winter, the important trick was not making the teepee airtight. Airtight sounds good until you remember that people need to breathe and fires need draft. The smarter goal was controlled air. A liner could hang inside the outer cover, creating a space where cold air entering low could be guided upward. That little hidden wall of air helped reduce drafts near the sleeping area. It made the shelter less like a naked cone in the wind and more like a breathing animal with an inner skin. The floor mattered just as much. Animal hides, robes, grasses, mats, and other materials could separate bodies from the cold earth. A buffalo robe was not a decorative blanket tossed over a couch for rustic charm. It was the winter body of an enormous animal, processed by human hands until it could lend its warmth to a human household. The hair side could trap air. The hide side could resist wind and damp. Several robes could create bedding, clothing, privacy, status, and survival all at once. In woodland regions, the shelter might not be a teepee at all. A wigwam, wetu, or related domed house could be framed with bent saplings and covered with bark, mats, rushes, hides, or other local materials. The names and designs varied by nation and region, because a word like wigwam has often been used lazily in English to flatten many distinct houses into one. But the dome shape had its own quiet genius. A curved surface could resist weather. Bark could shed precipitation. Inside, a hearth could sit near the centre, and sleeping spaces could run along the sides. In some northern woodland homes, people used platforms of poles padded with boughs, mats, or skins. And then there were boughs. Spruce, fir, cedar, and other evergreen branches appear in many cold-weather sleeping systems because they solve a problem that seems small until you are lying down. They lift the body, they create spring, they trap air, they keep bedding away from damp soil or packed snow. They smell sharp and resinous, a clean smell that probably did not make life easy, but may have made a smoky shelter feel less like living inside a tired chimney. Imagine a winter bed that begins with branches. Not a mattress from a store, but branches cut, carried, laid, replaced, and understood. On top of that might come mats, hides, robes, or woven materials. Then clothing stayed on, because bedtime did not mean changing into thin cotton pajamas with cheerful moons on them. Sleep was not a costume change into vulnerability. Sleep was a negotiation with the cold. Clothing itself was bedding. Moccasins, leggings, robes, parkas in northern regions, mittens, hoods, and layered garments were movable shelter. Fur and hide held warmth because they trapped air near the skin. The body heated that trapped air, and the layers tried to keep wind from stealing it. The same principle lives inside a modern down comforter, though the modern comforter rarely has to be scraped, tanned, smoked, softened, repaired, carried across country, and treated as a family asset. This is where the modern fantasy begins to break. We often imagine survival as one heroic trick, a spark, a shelter, a secret knot. But winter sleep was not a trick. It was a chain, and every link had to hold. A good shelter helped, a liner helped, a fire helped, dry bedding helped, enough food helped, sleeping near family helped, choosing the camp location helped, knowing the wind helped. The tent did not save them by itself. The tent was only the visible part, the part a stranger could sketch from a distance. The real shelter was the whole arrangement, the animal whose hide became the cover, the hands that prepared it, the person who knew where smoke would go, the children tucked between warmer bodies, the fuel gathered before dark, the fat eaten at supper, the robe pulled close, the small adjustment made at midnight when the wind changed. And somewhere in that darkness, heat was always trying to leave. The same rule follows you inside, where the shelter stops looking like a tent and starts behaving more like a small weather system. The warmest place was not simply near the fire. That is the kind of answer a person gives from a couch. In a real winter lodge, warmth had a geography. Close to the hearth, heat could sting your face while your back still felt the draft. Higher up, smoke and warm air gathered, but nobody could sleep comfortably in the smoke hole like a very confused bat. Along the edges where people actually lay down, the question became how to keep the lower air still, how to keep bedding dry, and how to prevent the frozen ground from quietly eating the night. This is why so much of winter sleeping was decided by what happened below the body. A modern person often thinks of blankets first, but blankets only slow the loss of heat upward and outward. Underneath you is where the betrayal begins. If your back is pressed against cold earth, packed snow, or a damp floor, your body becomes a little stove trying to heat the planet. The planet wins. So the bed began as a barrier. In woodland homes, sleeping platforms, or raised arrangements along the sides of a lodge could keep people above the cold floor. Where people slept closer to the ground, layers of mats, hides, grasses, bark or boughs did the same job in a different way. Fir or spruce boughs could form a springy base, not luxurious in the hotel sense, but intelligent in the old sense. The branches made tiny pockets of air. They separated robes from wetness. There is a particular intimacy to that kind of bed. It is not just furniture. It is yesterday's work under your shoulder blades. Someone cut those boughs. Someone dragged them in. Someone judged whether they were dry enough, thick enough, clean enough, worth replacing. Comfort did not arrive in a box. It arrived with cold fingers. Over that base came the warmer treasures: hides, robes, furs, woven mats, whatever the place, season, trade network and household could provide. On the plains, bison robes were central to winter life where they were available. A good robe was warmth, wealth, bedding, clothing, and portable architecture folded into one heavy object. In northern forests, moose, deer, bear, beaver, hare, and other animal materials could matter, depending on region and access. None of this should be flattened into one heroic blanket. The best winter materials did something very simple and very difficult. They trapped still air. Fur is not warm because it has magical warmth inside it. It is warm because it holds little spaces where air can rest, and resting air is harder for the cold to steal. This is the same quiet principle behind modern insulation, though modern insulation rarely comes with the memory of a hunt, a scraping tool, smoke, grease, sinew, and hours of handwork. That handwork matters. A hide did not become bedding because someone wished it so. It had to be removed, cleaned, scraped, stretched, softened, sometimes smoked, sometimes sewn, and maintained. Much of this labour, in many communities, was women's work, though roles varied by nation and period. If you slept warm, it was partly because someone had spent long hours turning a dead animal into a second skin for the living. There is a dark little comedy in how modern people sometimes talk about simple living. Simple, in history, often means that nothing is hidden from you. Your heat source needs fuel. Your bedding came from an animal. Your floor came from the forest. Your roof might need patching because the wind had opinions. Your comfort depended on whether someone had done the unglamorous work before sunset. And the sunset came early. In deep winter, the night was not a small pause between activities. It was an empire. It arrived before people were done working, and it stayed long enough to test every weakness in the household system. Damp moccasins, a gap near the door, bedding too close to sparks, smoke not drawing properly, a child who kicked free of the robe, a sick elder who could not generate enough body heat, fuel that burned too quickly. Each problem was small, until the temperature made it serious. Food belonged to the sleeping system too, though it does not look like bedding. A hungry body is a poor stove. In cold environments, calories mattered brutally, and fat mattered because it carried dense energy. Across different northern and plains lifeways, winter diets could depend on stored meat, dried foods, pemmican where it was made, fish, game, berries, roots, corn in agricultural communities, and whatever the season, region, and history allowed. But the principle was plain. The body had to be fed before it could spend the night making heat. This is another place where the fantasy of toughness fails. People did not stay warm because they ignored the body. They stayed warm because they listened to it, with a seriousness modern comfort has partly trained us to forget. Cold asks what you ate. It asks whether your feet are dry. It asks whether your bedding has loft. It asks whether your shelter breathes without gulping wind. It asks whether you have enough fuel to risk a fire through the night, or whether you must bank embers. Sleep in layers and trust the robes. Inside a winter dwelling, the arrangement of bodies could become part of the architecture. Families slept near one another, not because history was quaint and everyone loved togetherness in a greeting card way, but because shared warmth works. Children could be tucked closer to adults. Elders, the ill or exhausted people, were real bodies with heat loss, and a household that survived winter had to notice them. Privacy, by modern standards, was often limited. Thin walls, shared fires, family bedding, close quarters, stored food, hanging tools, smoke, animal materials, and sleeping bodies all lived in the same space. Yet it would be a mistake to read that only as discomfort. Privacy is not the only form of dignity. In a winter lodge, dignity might mean having a robe that did not let the wind through. It might mean dry feet. It might mean waking and finding that the fire still held a coal. The fire itself had moods. When it burned well, it gave the shelter a centre, a pulse. When it smoked badly, it punished everyone equally. Smoke holes and flaps mattered, because a fire inside a shelter is both friend and problem. It gives heat, but it also wants air. If the draft is wrong, smoke lowers into the living space. If the opening is too generous, warmth escapes. If everything is sealed too tightly, the fire struggles and the air grows unsafe. So someone had to understand not only fire, but moving air. A shift in wind could mean adjusting flaps, edges, or openings. In a teepee, smoke flaps were not decorative ears at the top of a picturesque cone. They were controls. In a bark or mat-covered lodge, ventilation could be managed with openings, smoke holes, or lifted sections depending on design. Shelter was not a dead object. It had to be tended, like a sleeping animal that occasionally tried to suffocate you or freeze you. The question asks how people slept without freezing, as if sleep began when they lay down. But winter sleep began in the hunt, in the sowing, in the gathering of boughs, in the stacking of fuel, in the cooking pot, in the choice of camp, in the repair of a seam, in the small learned motion of pulling a robe tighter before the cold found the opening. The night did not reward bravery. It rewarded preparation. What looked from the outside like one skin over a frame was, in practice, a careful argument with wind, and wind, on the winter plains especially, was not a detail. It was a force with personality. It found loose edges. It worried at seams. It turned a small gap into a flute and played cold air through it until sleep became impossible. A conical lodge answered wind with shape. It did not stand against the weather like a square wall waiting to be slapped. It leaned. It narrowed. It let moving air slide around it. The poles carried the cover upward into a point, and that point did more than look beautiful against the sky. It helped the shelter shed pressure. It made the home portable, yes, but also aerodynamic in the plain old human sense of trying not to be knocked over while everyone inside was asleep. On the plains, securing the bottom of the cover mattered, because the lower edge was where the night tried to enter. Stones, sod blocks, pegs, or other weights could hold the base down, depending on place and period. A loose bottom edge in warm weather might help air move. A loose bottom edge in winter could become a polite invitation to misery. The shelter had to breathe, but it could not gape. That is the little paradox at the heart of the winter lodge. You needed air, and you needed to stop air. You needed the fire to draw, but you did not want every breath of warmth pulled into the dark. You needed smoke to leave, but you did not want the roof of the world opened too wide. So the dwelling became a set of controlled leaks. Good leaks. Useful leaks. Leaks understood by people who had watched smoke in bad weather and learned that comfort sometimes depends on giving trouble a proper path. The inner liner of a teepee shows this intelligence especially clearly. Sources describe a liner, sometimes called an ozan or dew cloth in some contexts, hanging around the inside lower portion of the lodge. It did not usually go all the way to the top. Instead, it created a second wall near the people, with a space between liner and outer cover. Cold air entering low could be drawn upward through that gap, helping carry smoke toward the smoke hole while reducing the draft across the sleeping area. To a modern ear, that may sound like engineering. It was engineering, only made of hide, cloth, rope, memory, and hands. The smoke flaps above were part of the same conversation. They could be shifted with poles as wind changed direction, because the opening at the top was not just a hole, it was a chimney that had to be argued into working. When it worked well, smoke lifted. When it worked badly, the room filled with a harsh reminder that fire has never been a fully domesticated animal. It will warm your supper and then bite your eyes for no reason except that the wind turned. But not every winter home was built to travel across open grassland. In forested regions, the cold came through trees, along rivers, across frozen lakes, and into camps where wood, bark, mats, and snow shaped the possibilities. Domed or cone-shaped wigwams, used historically by many indigenous peoples in the eastern half of North America, could be framed with saplings and covered with bark, reed mats, hides, brush, or other available materials. These were not random huts. Their form reflected what the land offered: birch bark in one place, elm bark in another. Mats where reeds and rushes made sense, hides when animal materials were available and worth using. A dome handles winter differently from a cone. It holds a lower, rounder interior. It can be snug, it can be patched, it can be banked around the edges. Snow itself, handled carefully, can become an insulator outside a shelter, though snow is also damp trouble if it melts into bedding. Forest homes could benefit from windbreaks that the open plains did not always offer: trees, low ground, clustered camp layouts, and the ability to choose a site where weather would be less cruel. The old survival question was never simply, what is the best shelter? It was always, what is the best shelter here, with these materials, in this season, for these people, carrying these obligations? That last part matters. A shelter is not only a device, it is a household. It must fit sleeping bodies, stored food, tools, sacred objects, dogs in some communities, children, wet gear, visitors, repairs, sickness, birth, grief, jokes, quarrels, and the daily theatre of people being tired near each other. A perfect thermal design that cannot hold a family is not a home. A warm space that poisons everyone with smoke is not a solution. A portable lodge too heavy to move when the herd moves is a trap disguised as comfort. So the architecture had to compromise beautifully. In the coldest months, camp placement could become as important as shelter material. A good site reduced the amount of heroism required indoors. Among many mobile or seasonal communities, people understood where wind collected, where snow drifted, where fuel could be found, where animals might pass, and where water or ice could be reached without wasting half the day. A camp placed badly punished everyone. It meant longer fuel trips, more exposure, harder hauling, and more cold entering the shelter on every returning body. The doorway had meaning too. On the plains, teepee doors are often described as facing east, though practices varied. The east could greet the morning sun, but direction also had practical relationships with prevailing winds, camp order, and custom. A door is a humble thing until winter makes it dramatic. Every opening is a wound in the wall. Every person entering brings cold with them. Every door flap lifted carelessly lets the night crawl inside and look around. Inside, objects created smaller zones of protection: robes along the sleeping area, storage near edges, a backrest, a rolled hide, a mat hung to block a draft. The winter home was full of little decisions that might not appear in a grand history of nations, but mattered enormously at 2 a.m. Historians can record treaties, battles, migrations, epidemics, and trade routes. The body records whether the draft hit your feet. And this is where indigenous cold weather architecture becomes easy to underestimate. Because so much of it was flexible, organic, repaired, and portable, outsiders sometimes saw impermanence and mistook it for simplicity. They saw a dwelling that could be taken down and moved, and assumed that meant it was less sophisticated than a house of stone or plank. But permanence is not the only measure of intelligence. In a world where the food moved, the seasons changed, and survival depended on timing, a home that could move without losing its inner logic was not primitive, it was exact. A winter lodge had to be light enough, or at least manageable enough for its purpose. It had to be strong enough for wind, open enough for smoke, closed enough for heat, repairable with available materials, understandable in darkness, familiar to children, adaptable to weather, capable of being made by people who did not have the luxury of separating engineering from daily life. The modern house hides its systems in walls. The old winter shelter taught its systems to everyone who lived inside it. You knew the draft because you felt it. You knew the smoke because it found your throat. You knew the bedding because you helped carry it. You knew the fire because someone had to feed it. Nothing was abstract. The architecture explained itself through discomfort. And when the wind pressed hard against the cover, the whole household listened. The body notices first, long before the mind has a tidy explanation. It notices the edge of the robe that has slipped loose. It notices the dampness in a moccasin. It notices smoke lowering toward the eyes before anyone says the wind has turned. In a winter lodge, The body was not a passenger being carried through history. It was the alarm system. A person trying to sleep in that world did not simply lie down and disappear into dreams. Sleep had chores around it. Before night settled fully, clothing had to be managed, because cold clothing could become as dangerous as poor bedding. Snow clinging to moccasins, leggings, or robes could melt near the fire, then chill again when the fire sank. Dampness is winter's quiet little betrayal. It does not roar like wind. It waits until you are still, then turns cloth, hide, or fur against you. So drying mattered. Near the fire, wet items could be warmed, smoked, turned, watched. Too close and they might scorch. Too far and they stayed damp. A person had to understand heat not as an idea, but as distance. A few inches could be the difference between steam and sparks. Modern appliances have buttons for this. The older system had judgment. The smell inside a winter shelter would have been layered and human. Wood smoke, hides, cooked meat, damp earth, dry grass, evergreen boughs, stored food, bodies, maybe dogs in some camps, maybe the mineral smell of snow melting from clothing near the hearth. It was not the clean, pine-scented fantasy sold by candles with names like Arctic Lodge, because candles are allowed to lie. Real warmth has smells. It smells like fuel, fat, work, and everyone being alive in a small space. The smoke could be comforting from a distance and unpleasant up close. It helped dry things. It discouraged insects in warmer seasons. It could preserve materials. It also got into hair, bedding, eyes and lungs. A well-managed fire made the lodge livable. A badly drawing fire made it a room-sized complaint. People who lived with indoor hearths learned smoke the way sailors learn weather. They could read its direction, colour, heaviness and mood. If it curled wrong, something had changed. Fuel was another part of sleep. Not every region offered the same firewood, and not every camp had unlimited access to it. In forested areas, wood might be near, but gathering it still took labour, especially in deep snow or severe cold. On parts of the plains, where trees were less abundant, fuel could include wood from river bottoms, willow, brush, dried dung, or whatever local conditions made possible. A fire that burns all night sounds cosy until someone asks who gathered the fuel, who carried it, who saved it, who decided how much could be spent before dawn. That decision had consequences. A large fire warmed quickly but consumed fuel quickly. A small fire conserved fuel but gave less comfort. Embers could be banked. Fires could be fed during the night. Some households may have kept a careful watch. Others relied more heavily on bedding and clothing after the fire diminished. There was no universal answer because weather, shelter type, fuel supply, family needs, and regional practice all mattered. The past is often less interested in our clean categories than we would like. The fire also organised the room. People did not simply scatter themselves wherever a modern camping diagram would place them. The hearth was centre, but not all bodies could crowd the centre. Sparks, smoke, tools, cooking vessels, and stored items shaped the sleeping arrangement. Along the outer sleeping spaces, robes and mats became private geography. A child might learn where not to step, which bundle mattered, which edge of the bedding belonged to whom, and how to move without sending a draft across someone's feet. Cold teaches manners quickly. There were also nighttime sounds, the pop of wood, the settling of poles, hide or bark shifting against wind, a cough, a child turning, snow sliding softly from a cover, the low talk of someone still awake. In a shelter made partly from living materials, the house itself had a voice. It was not the silence of sealed, modern insulation. It was a breathing silence, full of little warnings. And then there was the door. A doorway in winter is never neutral. It is the place where the outside negotiates entry. Door covers made of hide, bark, mats or blankets could be weighted, tied, or arranged to reduce drafts. But every exit mattered. Someone going out for fuel, water, relief, animals, or a noise beyond the camp brought the dark with them when they returned. The air rolled in low and cruel, sliding across bedding before the cover fell back into place. A person did not need a thermometer to know the cost of a careless door. They felt it under the robe. It helps to imagine heat as something almost visible, a pale animal inside the room, easily frightened. It gathers near the fire, hides in fur, curls between sleeping bodies, climbs toward the smoke hole, and bolts whenever the door opens. The whole household is quietly trying not to scare it away. This is why sleeping arrangements could carry practical intelligence that outsiders did not always notice. Shared beds, close family sleeping, and layered robes were not signs that people lacked sophistication. They were ways of making the body part of the shelter. A person alone loses heat faster than a group arranged wisely. Children generate heat, but they also lose it easily and kick away covers with the ancient confidence of children everywhere. Elders may need more care. Someone ill or underfed might not warm the bedding quickly. Human closeness was not sentimental decoration, it was thermal strategy. Yet this closeness had a social cost. A crowded winter lodge could be warm and irritating at the same time, which is one of history's more reliable combinations. The person who snores is not improved by anthropology. Smoke does not become less annoying because the shelter is culturally significant. A child's elbow in the ribs remains a child's elbow. Survival did not erase personality. It compressed personality into a smaller, smokier room. That is part of what makes the story real. These were not mythical winter people gliding silently through snow with perfect wisdom. They were households. They were tired. They had preferences. They made mistakes. They repaired things. They argued softly or loudly. They laughed at bad luck when laughing was cheaper than despair. They knew what to do because knowledge had been taught, practiced, and enforced by consequence. Winter sleep then was less like falling into comfort and more like entering a maintained condition. Everything had to remain just good enough. The fire not too smoky, the bedding not too damp, the robe not too open, the door not too loose, the fuel not too low, the child not uncovered, the wind not slipping under the edge. None of these things alone sounds dramatic. Together, they are the difference between rest and danger. The strange thing is that the system could work beautifully. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but beautifully in the way a well-used tool is beautiful. The shelter did not defeat winter. It negotiated with it hour by hour, using hide, smoke, branches, food, and the stubborn heat of living bodies. The trouble is that warmth did not belong equally to everyone in the room. It could feel shared because the fire sat in the centre and the smoke rose over all heads. But the making of that warmth had a history before it reached the body. Someone had to kill the animal. Someone had to butcher it. Someone had to carry meat, scrape hide, soften hide, sew hide, gather fuel, prepare food, repair clothing, watch children, tend elders, and remember where each object belonged when darkness made the inside of the lodge smaller. In many plain societies, the lodge itself was deeply tied to women's labour and authority. This varied by nation, and it should never be flattened into one rule for all indigenous North America. But among many teepee-using peoples, women commonly made, owned, raised, packed, and maintained the teepee. That detail quietly changes the whole story. The winter shelter was not just a male hunting trophy stretched over poles. It was domestic engineering. And much of the engineering lived in the hands of women, who knew exactly how a seam behaved when frozen, how a cover stretched after weather, how bedding should be arranged, and what needed repair before the storm made repair impossible. A buffalo hide teepee cover could require many hides, and every hide carried labour inside it. National Park Service material on bison robes and teepee construction notes women's work in tanning and preparing hides, and early observers such as Lewis Garrard describe Cheyenne women stretching and working buffalo robes in the 1840s. These are outsider accounts, so they must be read carefully, but they point towards something broader and harder to romanticize. Winter comfort was manufactured through repetitive, skilled, physical labour. Think of the robe again. To the sleeping person, it is softness and warmth. To the person who made it, it is also weight, smell, scraping, stretching, grease, smoke, and time. A winter robe was a memory of effort you could pull over your shoulders. It might look peaceful in firelight, but peace was only its final disguise. This is where class, or at least household wealth and resource access, enters the shelter. We have to use the word carefully because indigenous social structures did not always map neatly onto European ideas of class. But inequality could still exist in practical forms. A household with more robes, better quality hides, good horses or dogs for transport in some regions and periods, stronger kin networks, more successful hunting, or better access to trade goods could face winter differently from a household with worn bedding, fewer stored foods, or sick relatives. Cold is democratic in theory. In practice, it asks what you own. After horses spread across much of the plains, many communities could transport larger lodges and more belongings than had been possible with dog travwise alone. That did not make winter easy, but it changed the scale of portability. Larger covers, more furnishings, heavier bedding, and more stored equipment could travel with families under the right conditions. Before that, and in regions where horses were not part of life, weight mattered even more sharply. A warm thing that cannot be moved may become useless when the camp must move. Trade changed the sleeping world too. Wool blankets, metal tools, kettles, canvas, guns, and other goods entered indigenous economies unevenly through trade, diplomacy, alliance, coercion, and colonial disruption. These goods could improve some parts of winter life, while tying people into dangerous new dependencies. A wool blanket could be useful. A metal knife could speed work. A canvas cover could change lodge construction. But trade also came with disease, debt, violence, land pressure, and the shattering of older food systems. No object arrived alone. Every useful thing carried a political shadow. So when we imagine someone sleeping warmly beneath a robe, we should also imagine the systems pressing around that robe. The buffalo herds, the women's work, the hunting parties, the seasonal camp, the kin obligations, the trade routes, the colonial forts, the changing tools, the fragile balance between adaptation and loss. A bed is never just a bed when the world is moving under it. Gender shaped winter survival in other ways too. In many communities, women's labour supported the daily functioning of the shelter, preparing hides, making clothing, cooking, processing food, managing household goods, and caring for children. Men's work often included hunting, warfare, diplomacy, certain tool-making tasks, and other duties depending on the people and period. But these categories were not rigid everywhere, and the details varied enormously. The safest way to say it is this: winter survival depended on a division of labour, and that division was social technology, as much as the lodge poles were physical technology. A badly made seam could let in wind. A badly managed social system could do the same. Children learned this technology early, not from a textbook, but from being corrected. Do not step there. Do not waste fuel. Do not let the flap hang open. Keep that dry. Bring that inside. Watch the sparks. Stay near the robe. These small instructions were not fussy household rules. They were survival grammar. The winter lodge taught people how to behave by making comfort disappear when they behaved badly. Elders carried another form of warmth: memory. They knew old winters, bad camps, failed hunts, storms that had punished arrogance, signs in the sky or snow that younger people might miss. In a long winter night, stories were not only entertainment, they were storage systems for knowledge, lore, humour, caution, kinship, and identity. A story could make time pass, but it could also teach a child why greed was dangerous, why certain animals mattered, why a rule existed, or why the careless person in the tale always ends up cold, hungry, embarrassed, or eaten by consequences. That last category is one of history's most reliable predators. The home also had a moral order, where people sat, who served food, who owned which objects, who could speak freely, who was being watched, who deserved extra care, who had failed to do their share. All of this lived beside the fire. We should not imagine the winter lodge as a perfect circle of harmony, because no human room has ever deserved that much optimism. But neither should we reduce it to hardship. It was a place of skill, affection, irritation, ceremony, teaching, labour, and ordinary fatigue. It held the beautiful and the annoying, because homes always do. The cold made those relationships practical. A lazy person was not merely annoying, they could become dangerous. A generous household could become a refuge. A careless visitor could waste heat. A skilled hide worker could improve everyone's night. A good hunter's success could be felt in the bedding, the stew, the clothing, and the confidence with which people listened to the wind. This is why the question, how did they sleep without freezing, slowly turns into another question. Who made it possible for anyone to sleep at all? The answer is not only the hunter, though hunting mattered. Not only the fire, though fire mattered. Not only the teepee or wigwam or winter lodge, though shelter mattered. The answer is the household as a working organism. The warm night was assembled by many roles, some praised, some expected, some invisible until they failed. And in that sense, the deepest insulation in the lodge was not fur, it was responsibility. Delivery 6. By then, the hidden rule has become clear. The cold does not need to win all at once. It only needs to win a little, again and again. A little heat lost through the ground, a little heat pulled out by damp clothing, a little heat rising too quickly through the smoke hole, a little heat escaping when the door lifts, a little heat spent by an underfed body trying to warm itself under a robe that has gone flat from moisture. Winter is patient. It is not always the dramatic blizzard outside the shelter. Sometimes it is a series of tiny thefts. This is why the old sleeping systems were not just about producing heat, they were about slowing loss. The difference is important. Producing heat is obvious. You see a flame and understand it immediately. Slowing loss is quieter. It hides in the thickness of a robe, in dead air between a liner and an outer cover, in boughs under bedding, in a weighted edge, in a door flap that falls properly, in the way people do not open the shelter more than necessary. It is the difference between pouring water into a leaking bucket and learning where the leaks are. A winter lodge was full of leak management. In a teepee, the liner helped create a controlled airspace along the lower interior, reducing drafts where people sat and slept while helping smoke move upward when the draft worked properly. The smoke flaps above could be adjusted as wind changed, because the shelter's chimney was not mechanical. It had to be corrected by hand, by eye, by experience. The outer cover might be secured with stones, sod, or pegs at the base, because the coldest air wanted the lowest entrance. The whole structure worked best when people understood that air was not empty. Air was a substance with habits. In wigwams and related woodland dwellings, layers did the same kind of work in a different language. Bark or hide could cover the frame. Mats, moss, grass, or extra insulating materials might protect against weather. Floors could be covered with boughs and hides, turning the bottom of the house into part of the warmth system. These were not decorative touches. They were the difference between sitting inside a shelter and living inside one. The principle is almost disappointingly simple. Trap air, block wind, stay dry, feed the body, control smoke, conserve fuel. But simple principles do not mean easy lives. They mean that if one principle failed, the whole night could become harder. Moisture was one of the worst failures because it changed the meaning of everything it touched. Fur works by trapping air, but wet fur traps less helpful air. Clothing works by holding warmth near the skin, but wet clothing pulls warmth away. Bedding works by separating the body from the ground, but damp bedding becomes a cold hand under your back. Even breath adds moisture. Even cooking adds moisture. Even bodies sleeping close together change the air. So the fire had to dry as well as warm. It had to keep the shelter livable without making it smoky beyond endurance. A little smoke might be part of life. Too much smoke made sleep miserable and could make the eyes burn and the throat ache. But an over-opened smoke hole could drain heat. A sealed shelter could become unsafe and smoky. Again, the answer was balance, not brute force. Modern comfort likes automation. A thermostat listens for us. A furnace wakes without being asked. Insulation hides in walls like a servant who has agreed never to be seen. In the winter lodge, the system was visible and demanding. Someone noticed the smoke, someone adjusted the flap, someone moved the drying moccasins, someone shook out a robe, someone tucked an edge, someone added fuel or decided not to. Warmth came with attention. That attention extended to the body itself. Feet mattered enormously. A cold foot can ruin a good philosophy. In many indigenous societies, moccasins and leggings were not minor accessories. They were daily survival tools. Materials and styles varied by region, season, and people, but the winter goal was familiar: protect the feet, keep them as dry as possible, and maintain warmth while still allowing movement. Footwear had to handle snow, frozen ground, dampness, and wear. A person might be wrapped in a fine robe, but if the feet were wet and cold, sleep would not arrive kindly. Hands mattered too. So did the head. A large amount of discomfort begins at the edges of the body, where circulation, exposure, and contact with cold surfaces make themselves known. Hoods, caps, mittens, sleeves, and robes were not merely clothing, they were plugs in the leaking vessel of the human body. The body is warmest at its centre, but winter attacks the margins first. It asks the fingers and toes whether the household prepared well enough. The sleeping posture itself could change: curling, sharing robes, turning away from a draught, keeping limbs close, sleeping near others, arranging bedding so the cold could not slide in. These are humble behaviours, almost too ordinary to record. Yet most survival is made of humble behaviours. History remembers the grand names of chiefs, explorers, generals, governors, missionaries, and traders. The winter night remembers whether someone pulled the robe under their shoulder before falling asleep. And that robe carried a whole ecology. If it was bison, it came from the plains, and from an animal whose body shaped food, shelter, tools, clothing, containers, ceremony, and economy. If it was deer, moose, beaver, bear, rabbit, or another animal, it carried a different landscape inside it. The shelter was not separate from the surrounding world. The land entered the home as poles, bark, hides, boughs, fuel, food, cordage, sinew, mats, and memory. The warmth inside was the outside world reorganized. This is what makes the phrase winter tent feel smaller than the reality. A tent sounds like a purchased object. A winter lodge was a relationship with materials. It needed animals, it needed trees, it needed skilled hands, it needed seasonality. It needed knowledge of where to camp and when to move. It needed repair. It needed enough social cooperation to keep the system from failing when one person was tired, sick, grieving, pregnant, injured, very young, or very old. The cold revealed interdependence without mercy. A lone modern camper might imagine survival as personal competence. Make fire, build shelter, endure. But a family winter camp was not only a test of individuals, it was a test of shared systems. One person's work became another person's warmth. One person's mistake became everyone's draft. One person's successful hunt became food in the pot, fat in the body, hide over the frame, robe on the bed. One person's sewing held back a wind that would otherwise visit every sleeping face. That is the hidden mechanism. Warmth was distributed labour. Not evenly, not always fairly, not without exhaustion, and not in some perfect romantic circle, but distributed. The fire did not stand alone. The robe did not stand alone. The shelter did not stand alone. Each one depended on the others, and all depended on people remembering that winter punishes gaps. When the wind moved across the camp and pressed at the shelter's skin, it was testing more than architecture. It was testing the hunt, the sowing, the gathering, the cooking, the teaching, the patience, the repairs, and the quiet discipline of everyone who had spent the day preparing for a darkness that could not be argued with. The cold was outside. The system was inside. And when the system failed, it usually failed through something small enough to ignore at first. A seam loosened. A robe stayed damp. A family arrived late to camp and had to raise shelter with tired hands. A storm shifted after dark. The firewood pile looked adequate in the afternoon and insulting by midnight. A child came in wet from snow, and the wetness travelled into bedding like a rumour nobody wanted. The danger of winter sleep was rarely one dramatic moment with music swelling behind it. It was accumulation. One small loss of heat joined another, and then another, until the body understood the situation before pride did. Cold is good at removing fantasy. It does not care whether a person is brave, respected, skilled, young, stubborn, or deeply committed to pretending everything is fine. If the bedding is damp, the bedding is damp. If the fire smokes, the eyes burn. If the wind finds the lower edge of the cover, it will keep finding it until someone fixes the problem or everyone suffers. This is one reason winter knowledge had to be practical rather than decorative. A story about endurance was useful only if it taught someone where to put their hands. On the plains, where tipis could be built for movement as well as shelter, the ability to take a home down and rebuild it was a kind of freedom, but not an easy one. The structure was portable because the people's lives often had to follow animals, seasons, water, grass, and safety. The Encyclopedia of the Great Plains notes that the teepee cover was laced in front up to the smoke flaps and then secured at the bottom, historically with stones or sod blocks in some cases. Which reminds us that the home had to be both movable and firmly held when weather arrived. That is a difficult balance. A house light enough to leave, strong enough to stay. In winter, moving was not just an inconvenience, it was a bodily event. Poles had weight, covers had weight, bedding had weight. Frozen hands made simple tasks clumsy. Snow changed distance. A mile became longer when pulling, carrying, packing, unpacking, watching children, minding animals, and trying not to sweat into clothing that would later chill you. Modern people talk about setting up camp as if it were a wholesome activity before cocoa. In deep winter, setting up camp was labour performed under a deadline written by the sun. A late shelter was a dangerous shelter. If people reached a site too close to dark, every task crowded together, raising the frame, securing the cover, arranging the hearth, bringing in bedding, managing food, collecting or rationing fuel, settling children, protecting stored goods, and doing all of it while cold made fingers stupid. This is one of the least glamorous truths of winter survival. The mind may remain clever, but the hands begin filing complaints. The woodland version of the same pressure looked different but felt familiar. A wigwam or related bark and mat-covered dwelling could be sturdy and warm when properly built, with floors covered in boughs and animal hide bedding to make sitting and sleeping more comfortable, as the Canadian Encyclopedia describes. But bark had to be gathered or reused, mats had to be made, frames had to be repaired, bough floors had to be refreshed, fireplaces had to be managed. A home could be snug, but snugness was maintained, not magically possessed. The worst enemy was often wet cold, because it corrupts the very materials meant to save you. Dry snow can sometimes be brushed away. Damp snow, freezing rain, thawing slush, and smoke-heavy moisture are more treacherous. They enter clothing, flatten insulation, and turn bedding from protection into a slow thief. The Canadian Encyclopedia notes that wigwam frames could be wrapped in bark or hides, with moss or grass mats sometimes packed around bark for protection against rain and heavy winds. That detail matters because winter was not always clean, sparkling cold. Sometimes it was ugly weather, mixed weather, the kind that makes every surface questionable. In that kind of weather, fire became more complicated. More fire could mean more drying, but also more smoke, more fuel consumed, more risk to bedding, more labour outside. Less fire conserved fuel, but allowed dampness to linger. If the smoke hole drew badly, the shelter could become warmer and more miserable at the same time, which is a very human kind of compromise. The North Dakota State Museum describes the teepee's ozan, or dew cloth, as a lining made from hide, canvas, or blankets, part of the technology that helped the structure function as more than a simple cover. But even good technology still depended on use. A liner did not think for anyone, it simply gave experienced people a better way to manage air. Then there was hunger. Cold weather has a way of making food feel less like culture and more like physics. That does not mean food was only fuel. Meals carried meaning, memory, kinship, ceremony, preference, and pleasure. But a body that has not eaten enough struggles to heat itself. Winter sleep after adequate food is not the same as winter sleep after scarcity. Fat-rich foods, dried meat, stored plants, fish, pemmican in communities where it was made. And other seasonal supplies belonged to the thermal system because the body itself was one of the fires being kept alive. Scarcity changed the inside of the shelter. It made tempers shorter. It made children harder to comfort. It made elders more vulnerable. It made every fuel decision feel heavier because food and fire were both stored effort disappearing into immediate need. The cozy glow of a winter lodge can look timeless from far away, but inside people may have been calculating in silence. How much meat remains, how much fuel remains, how long the storm will last, whether the hunters will return, whether tomorrow's cold will be worse. This is where winter becomes social rather than merely environmental. A household with enough robes, enough food, enough help, and healthy adults could meet the night differently from a household already weakened by illness, grief, poor hunting, conflict, displacement, or colonial disruption. By the 19th century in many regions, indigenous winter systems were under increasing pressure from disease, military violence, trade dependency, forced movement, and the destruction or restriction of animal resources. On the plains, the catastrophic destruction of bison herds in the 19th century did not just remove food. It attacked shelter, clothing, bedding, tools, economy, and spiritual life all at once. That is a hard thing to hold gently, but it matters. To ask how people slept warm under bison robes is also, eventually, to ask what happened when bison were no longer available in the old abundance. A robe was not a luxury accessory. A hide lodge cover was not rustic decor. These things were part of a living system, and when colonial expansion damaged that system, the cold did not become less cold out of courtesy. Still, the older knowledge did not vanish simply because pressure increased. People adapted, with trade blankets, canvas, stoves in some later contexts, log structures, reservation housing, mission buildings, army-issued goods, improvised materials, and whatever could be made to work. But adaptation under coercion should not be mistaken for peaceful modernization. Sometimes a new blanket is a useful object. Sometimes it is also evidence that someone has been pushed out of the world that once supplied the robe. Inside the winter shelter, all of this could be felt in ordinary things. A thin cover, a patched seam, a robe worn past its best years, a meal stretched too far, a fire kept smaller than anyone wanted. History does not always enter the home carrying a flag. Sometimes it enters as a draft. And once it is inside, everyone feels where the system has been weakened. The surprising thing, after all that labour and risk, is that the inside could still become gentle. Not gentle in the soft modern way, where warmth hums invisibly from vents and a mattress rises from the floor like a private island. Gentle in an older, more temporary way. The kind of gentle made from a fire settling into coals, children finally quiet, robes pulled close, and the wind forced to spend the night outside looking for a weakness. A winter shelter could be smoky, crowded, imperfect, and still become the safest place in the world once the last chores were done. The light would have helped. Firelight changes a room by making everything smaller and more forgiving. The poles above a teepee, the curved frame of a wigwam, the hanging edges of hides or mats, the bundles along the wall, the shapes of sleeping people under robes, all of it would move slightly in the glow. A face near the hearth appears, disappears, appears again. Smoke softens the air. Shadows climb the cover and slide back down. The whole room seems alive, which is only fair, because the room is made from things that were alive. Trees, animals, grasses, hands. That is a very different kind of comfort from the kind produced by machines. Mechanical comfort tries to remove awareness. You are warm because the house has agreed not to bother you. Older comfort did the opposite. It kept awareness close. You knew why you were warm. You knew what was burning. You knew what covered you. You knew which seam had been patched. You knew who had been outside gathering fuel. You knew whether the wind had quieted or merely paused to think of something worse. And because the shelter required attention, calm itself could feel earned. There might be stories at night. Not always, not everywhere, not as a constant bedtime performance for our imagination. But in many Indigenous communities, winter was a season when storytelling held particular importance. Among some peoples, certain stories were traditionally told in winter rather than summer, often because winter nights created the time and setting for teaching, humour, memory, and moral instruction. The details vary widely, and some stories are not ours to retell casually. But the broader point matters. Night in the shelter was not empty time. It could become social time, teaching time, memory time. That may have helped sleep in a way no blanket could. A story organises fear. It gives the dark a shape. A child listening to an elder's voice might still hear wind outside, still smell smoke, still feel the press of other bodies nearby. But the mind had somewhere to go. The storm outside became part of a larger order, not just random cold scratching at the wall. There is something deeply human in that. When weather grows too large, people make rhythm. They make songs, stories, jokes, rules, gestures, little rituals of arrangement. The shelter holds the body, but rhythm holds the mind. A winter night is easier to survive when it has a beginning, a middle, and a reason not to panic before dawn. Humour probably had its place too. Not the loud, polished kind meant for a stage, but the small domestic kind. Someone complaining about smoke, as if smoke had personally insulted them. Someone joking about a robe hog. Someone teasing a child who tried to occupy the warmest space with the moral certainty of a tiny chief. Dark weather does not eliminate ordinary comedy. It sharpens it. When everyone is trapped indoors, the joke becomes a pressure valve. The lodge survives not only by holding heat, but by releasing irritation before it becomes trouble. And yet the comfort was never separate from discipline. You could not simply relax your way through winter. Even at rest, people remained part of the system. The fire had to be watched or banked. Sparks had to be respected. Infants and small children had to be kept warm. Damp things had to be kept away from dry bedding. The door had to be managed. A person might wake because the body noticed cold before the mind did, then reach half asleep for the robe edge and close the little gap. A tiny motion. A survival motion. In a teepee, that whole interior depended on the elegant cooperation of structure and habit. The National Park Service describes a life-size teepee made from buffalo hides stretched over lodgepole pine, while the North Dakota State Museum explains how an inner liner, or ozone, created a gap that helped produce a chimney effect and pull smoke upward through the top opening. That detail is wonderfully plain. People were not merely sitting inside a cone. They were living inside a controlled airflow device. In a wigwam, comfort worked through a different arrangement of materials. The Canadian Encyclopedia describes bark or animal hides wrapped around a frame, sometimes protected with moss or grass mats against rain and heavy winds, with floors covered in tree boughs and animal hide blankets for sitting and sleeping. That image matters because the floor, walls, doorway and bedding all cooperate. The shelter does not have one warm part. It becomes warm through agreement among parts. This is the midpoint where the question begins to change. At first, we ask how anyone avoided freezing, because we are imagining the cold as the whole story. But the longer we stay inside, the more we see that the cold was only one character. There was also design. There was work. There was family. There was habit. There was frustration, yes, and smoke, and risk, and scarcity. But there was also a kind of intelligence that made rest possible in a world that did not offer rest freely. That intelligence did not make people invulnerable. It did not erase suffering, and it should not be turned into a romantic painting where everyone glows nobly in the snow. People got cold. People became ill. People endured hunger. Children cried. Elders suffered. Fires failed. Storms overwhelmed good plans. The point is not that the system was magical. The point is that it was real, and because it was real, it had limits. A real system can be admired without pretending it never broke. So imagine the shelter again, not from outside this time, but from the floor. You are low, near the bedding. The boughs beneath you bend slightly. A robe is heavy across your shoulder. The air nearest the ground is cooler, but the draft is less sharp because someone arranged the liner or the wall covering well. The fire is no longer bright enough to demand attention, just enough to keep the centre breathing. Somewhere above, smoke finds its way out. Somewhere outside, wind moves across snow and keeps going. You are not warm because winter has been defeated. You are warm because heat has been persuaded to stay a little while. And for one long night, that is enough. The deeper contradiction is that the winter home could be both fragile and brilliantly strong at the same time. A tipi cover could ripple in the wind and still survive weather that would embarrass a careless modern camper. A bark-covered lodge could look humble from a distance and still hold a family through a night when the trees cracked with cold. A robe could be soft enough for sleep and tough enough to carry the memory of an animal that once pushed through snow with its own heat sealed under fur. Everything inside seemed temporary. Poles, hides, mats, boughs, fire, smoke, bodies. Nothing looked permanent in the way stone looks permanent. Yet permanence was not the point. The point was renewal. The shelter worked because it could be remade. A bough floor could be refreshed, a seam could be repaired, a hide could be softened again, a smoke flap could be shifted, a camp could move, bedding could be dried, fuel could be gathered, children could be taught. The entire system accepted that winter would keep changing the terms, and so the home had to remain changeable too. That is a difficult idea for modern comfort to admire, because modern comfort often worships the fixed thing, the solid wall, the sealed window, the furnace hidden in the basement, the roof that stays where it is for 30 years and only asks for money in terrifying amounts when it finally complains. We associate safety with buildings that do not move, but many indigenous winter systems were built around another kind of intelligence, safety through adaptability. If the animals moved, people might move. If a site became poor for fuel, hunting, water or safety, the camp might shift. If the wind changed, the shelter adjusted. If trade goods entered the economy, people could incorporate them without forgetting older principles. If bark was the right material, bark became wall. If bison hide was the right material, hide became wall. If snow itself could help insulate around a base, snow could be used carefully. If too much snow threatened dampness, it had to be cleared. Nothing was simply good or bad. Everything depended on use. That kind of knowledge is easy to miss because it does not always leave monuments. A stone building can sit in ruins for centuries and invite tourists to admire the empire. A winter sleeping system made from hides, boughs, mats and smoke usually returns to earth. The evidence becomes scattered: tool marks, hearths, oral traditions, museum objects, outsider descriptions, archaeological patterns, surviving craft knowledge, and the memories carried by descendant communities. The most intimate technologies often leave the least boastful traces. A bed of evergreen boughs does not carve its autobiography into marble. And because so much evidence is partial, we have to be careful. We can describe general principles with confidence: insulation, layering, fire management, ventilation, ground separation, clothing, food, and shared warmth. We can point to documented shelter types, from plains tipis to woodland wigwams, and many others. We can say that people used materials suited to region and season, but we should not pretend to know every nighttime arrangement in every household across centuries. The past is not a furnished room we can simply walk into and inventory. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the honesty. Early European observers often described indigenous dwellings through their own expectations, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with respect, sometimes with arrogance so thick it could have been used as insulation if arrogance had any practical value. Missionaries, soldiers, traders and travellers did not always understand what they were seeing. They might notice smoke and miss airflow, notice crowding and miss warmth, notice portability and miss engineering, notice animal hides and miss the labour politics inside them. The outside observer often saw poverty where the household saw a working system. That does not mean every indigenous dwelling was comfortable, or that hardship should be polished into beauty. It means outsiders often judged with the wrong ruler. They measured permanence when they should have measured fit. They measured resemblance to European houses when they should have measured whether a child could sleep through the wind. There is a quiet arrogance in assuming that a house is only advanced when it looks difficult to move. The winter lodge was difficult in another direction. It had to concentrate skill into materials that could be carried, repaired, replaced, and understood by the people who depended on them. That is not lesser architecture. That is architecture under pressure. And the pressure came not only from weather. The animals mattered. This is the part of the story that feels warm inside the lodge and enormous outside it. A bison robe, a deer hide, a moose hide, rabbit skin weaving, beaver pelts, bear fur, sinew, bone tools, antler tools, fat, meat, tallow, rawhide containers. These things were not separate categories in life. The animal world entered the household in many forms. Food became heat in the body. Hide became heat around the body. Bone and antler became tools that helped make more warmth possible. Sinew became thread. Fat became calories, sometimes treatment for materials, sometimes cooking. Nothing was wasted in the tidy modern phrase, but not because people were performing sustainability for an audience. Waste was expensive. Winter made waste insulting. A household that had good robes was holding animal heat after the animal had died. That sounds poetic, but it is also physically true. Fur had evolved to keep an animal alive in cold conditions, and humans learned to borrow that structure. The robe was not merely a symbol of nature, it was nature's engineering reworked by human engineering. Two kinds of intelligence met over the sleeping body. This makes the destruction of animal systems especially devastating. When bison herds were destroyed in the 19th century through commercial hunting, military policy, market demand, and colonial expansion, the loss was not only dietary, it was architectural, economic, spiritual, domestic, and thermal. It reached into lodges, beds, clothing, storage, tools, ceremony, trade, and memory. To remove the animal was to remove part of the house before anyone touched the poles. That is the contradiction again. The winter shelter was adaptable, but not infinitely adaptable. It could answer wind, it could answer snow, it could answer ordinary seasonal hardship, but no household technology can fully protect people from the organized destruction of the world that supplies it. Still, inside the older winter system, before those losses are allowed to become the whole story, there remains a lesson in proportion. The shelter was small under the sky, but it was not helpless. It took pieces of the wider world and arranged them into a pocket of life. Trees became frame and floor, animals became roof and robe, fire became center, food became inner warmth, kinship became shared heat, knowledge became the invisible wall around all of it. So the strange answer to the original question keeps widening. They slept without freezing, not because the shelter was thick in the modern sense, and not because the people were made of stronger material than anyone else. They slept because many relationships held for one more night, between hunter and herd, maker and hide, elder and child, fire and smoke, wind and flap, ground and bough, hunger and food, body and robe. Warmth was not stored in one object. It was spread across the world, then gathered carefully into the room. The hidden cost appears most clearly in the exceptions, because a system always looks strongest when we imagine it working under ideal conditions. A good robe, dry bedding, a well-pitched lodge, enough fuel, enough food, healthy adults, children who stayed tucked in, weather that behaved within the range of experience. Under those conditions, winter sleep could be hard but manageable. Not luxurious, not easy, but possible in a deeply intelligent way. The problem is that winter does not owe anyone ideal conditions. It specializes in exceptions. Someone gets sick. That changes everything. A healthy body helps warm itself. It shivers. It digests food. It curls, adjusts, wakes, reaches for the robe edge, complains, and moves closer to heat. A sick body may not do those things well. fever, weakness, hunger, injury, childbirth recovery, infection, age, exhaustion after travel. Any of these could turn an ordinary winter night into a private crisis. The same shelter that held a family comfortably might not be enough for a person whose body could no longer produce or manage heat. This is where the warmth system becomes tender and frightening at the same time. People could move closer, add coverings, feed broth, meat, fat, or whatever food and medicine the community considered appropriate. Keep the person away from drafts. Watch the fire more carefully. Let a child sleep between warmer bodies. Give an elder the better robe. These are not grand gestures. They are the small mercies by which households have always fought the unfairness of bodies. But small mercies are limited by resources. If there were not enough robes, someone got the poorer covering. If food was short, everyone's inner fire burned lower. If fuel was scarce, the household had to decide whether to spend wood now or save it for later. If the shelter was crowded, closeness helped warmth but made rest harder. If smoke was bad, the person who needed warmth might also suffer from air that irritated the throat and eyes. The system was clever, but cleverness does not abolish scarcity. It only gives scarcity a harder opponent. Infants and small children created another pressure point. They lose heat easily, and they do not respect bedding protocols. A child can escape a robe with the tactical brilliance of water escaping a cracked pot. They wriggle, turn, kick, sweat, chill, wake, cry, and require adults to notice. In a winter shelter, childcare was not separate from heat management. Keeping a child warm meant checking coverings, keeping clothing dry, positioning bodies, feeding, soothing, and preventing the small disaster of one damp garment becoming a cold night for everyone nearby. There is no need to romanticize that. It was exhausting. The sweetness of a child asleep under robes came with the knowledge that someone else had stayed alert long enough to make that sleep possible. Pregnancy and childbirth also belong to the winter story, though we have to speak carefully because practices varied widely across nations and periods, and many details are not ours to generalize from a distance. What can be said plainly is that childbirth in cold seasons added vulnerability. Warmth, privacy, clean materials, support from experienced women, recovery, infant care, food and protection from exposure all mattered. A winter shelter was not just a sleeping machine. It was sometimes a birth room, sick room, kitchen, workshop, storage room, classroom, and chapel of daily survival all at once. That many functions in one space created another hidden cost. There was almost no true escape from the household system. Modern people often treat privacy as a basic ingredient of rest. A closed bedroom door, a separate bed, a bathroom with a lock, a thermostat you can adjust because you are mildly annoyed. In many winter dwellings, privacy was thinner. People slept near tools, food, family members, smoke, conversation, grief, labour, and each other's moods. This was not necessarily a lack of dignity, it was a different arrangement of life. But it did mean that one person's discomfort became audible. One cough entered everyone's sleep. One quarrel heated the room in the wrong way. One crying baby moved through the shelter like weather. One person careless with the doorway could make everyone feel the outside. The winter home made interdependence impossible to ignore, which is beautiful in theory and occasionally maddening in practice. The exception might also be travel. A winter camp that was already established had advantages. Bedding arranged, fuel known, shelter tested, routines settled. Travel stripped some of that away. A hunting party, a family moving camp, messengers, traders, visiting kin, people forced to relocate, or people caught by changing weather faced a harsher problem. The full home system was harder to carry in motion. You might have robes, tools, food, and knowledge, but not the same stability. You might sleep in a quickly made shelter, a smaller travelling lodge, a windbreak, a brush shelter, or whatever the region and circumstances allowed. The question was no longer how to be comfortable, it was how to lose less heat than the night wanted to take. Travel in deep cold also introduced sweat, one of winter's more insulting traps. Work hard while wrapped too warmly, and sweat dampens clothing. Stop moving, and that dampness chills. The body becomes its own bad weather. Experienced cold weather peoples understood this, because anyone who ignored it learned quickly. Warmth while moving and warmth while resting are not the same problem. Winter punishes people who confuse them. The same was true for fire. A large fire can feel like salvation during a cold stop, but it can also melt snow into clothing, create steam, consume fuel, or encourage people to neglect better insulation. Fire is dramatic, insulation is boring. History often survives because boring things work. And then there were emergencies that no sleeping system could solve cleanly. Storms that lasted too long, failed hunts, sudden illness, attacks, forced movements, epidemics, colonial violence, and the slow destruction of familiar resources. The older winter technologies were resilient because they were integrated with land and community. But that integration also meant that damage to land and community damaged the shelter itself. A robe does not exist without animals. A camp routine does not exist without freedom to camp. A food system does not exist without access to food. A family cannot simply adapt forever when the ground beneath adaptation is being taken away. So the cost of winter sleep was vigilance. Not panic, not constant terror, but vigilance as a way of life. The kind that notices dampness before it becomes danger, notices wind before it becomes a draft, notices a child before the child wakes cold, notices an elder's silence, notices that fuel is lower than it should be, notices that the robe needs repair before the next storm, notices that the old place to camp is no longer safe, or no longer allowed, or no longer supplied by the animals that once made it sensible. The warmest household was not the one that never faced danger. It was the one that noticed danger early. That may be the least glamorous survival skill and the most important. Not bravery, not toughness, not some mysterious ancient resistance to cold. Attention. Repeated, practical, inherited attention. The kind that makes a person seem calm because they have already checked the thing that would frighten someone else later. Inside the shelter, this attention could look almost invisible. A hand reaches in the dark and pulls a robe over a child's shoulder. A person shifts a damp item farther from the bedding. Someone wakes and tends the coals. Someone listens to the wind and knows whether it is merely loud or becoming serious. Someone, half asleep, presses a foot against the edge of a mat and feels cold air slipping through. Then the hand moves. The system survives because the hand moves before dawn. The human cost was not always dramatic enough for a story told from far away. It was not always a famous disaster, a recorded expedition, a battle, a treaty, a famine named in documents, or a winter so terrible that outsiders wrote it down with frightened ink. Sometimes the cost was quieter. A woman's hands cracked from hide work and cold water. A hunter came back exhausted and still had to help unload before warmth could happen. An elder slept poorly because the better robe had gone to a child. Someone woke 5 times in one night to check the coals, then rose before daylight because the day did not care how badly anyone had slept. History often remembers survival as if survival were a single victory. It was more often a bill paid in small installments. The winter shelter asked for the body. Not in one heroic sacrifice, but repeatedly. It asked shoulders to carry poles, arms to scrape hides, knees to bend at the hearth, backs to sleep on boughs, lungs to tolerate smoke, eyes to water, stomachs to manage scarcity, fingers to sew when they were already tired. It asked people to remain competent while uncomfortable, which is one of the most underrated forms of human intelligence. There is a specific tiredness that belongs to cold climates. It is not just sleepiness. It is the heaviness that comes from doing every ordinary task with extra resistance. Fetching water is harder. Cutting fuel is harder. Dressing is harder. Drying clothing is harder. Moving from one place to another is harder. Even standing still becomes a decision. The cold makes life expensive. It adds a hidden tax to every motion. And then night arrives, pretending to be rest. But night has its own work. Someone may need to feed the fire. Someone may need to check where the smoke is drawing. Someone may need to shift a drying item before sparks reach it. Someone may need to soothe a child, tend a sick person, or listen for animals, weather, or danger outside the shelter. Sleep comes, but it may not come in one deep, clean piece. It may come in fragments, wrapped around responsibility. For the people inside, this did not necessarily feel extraordinary. That is another trap in how we imagine the past. We look back and see hardship everywhere, then assume people walked around constantly aware of being historically impressive. They did not. They were living their own normal. Smoke was annoying, not cinematic. A robe could be valuable and still smell unpleasant. A cold morning could be endured without becoming a metaphor. People had jokes, complaints, habits, preferences, petty irritations, pride, laziness, tenderness, and bad moods. They were not survival statues. That ordinary humanity matters because it protects them from becoming symbols. If we turn Indigenous winter life only into a lesson about toughness, we flatten real people into inspirational weather equipment. If we turn it only into suffering, we make the same mistake from the other side. The truth is fuller. People suffered, adapted, laughed, worked, remembered, taught, misjudged, repaired, and slept when they could. A child inside the shelter might know the winter world first as sensation rather than system. The scratch of bedding, the heavy robe, the glow that made adult faces look strange, the smell of smoke in hair, the warning not to push the cover aside, the soft threat in a parent's voice when the door flap was lifted too long. The cold was not an abstract climate. It was the thing that entered when you forgot the rule. In that way, winter trained memory through the body. A child learned that warmth was communal because the body felt the loss when someone behaved carelessly. They learned that objects had value because a damaged robe made night worse. They learned that adults carried invisible maps of weather, fuel, food, and danger. They learned that comfort was made, not granted. For women in many communities, the cost could be especially constant because so much domestic survival labour gathered around them. This must be said carefully because gender roles varied widely and Indigenous societies cannot be reduced to a single pattern. But where women prepared hides, maintained lodges, made clothing, processed food, cared for children, and managed household goods, winter warmth carried the pressure of their skill. A seam that held against wind was not a minor domestic detail. It was architecture made with thread. The body remembers that kind of work in ways documents rarely honour. Repetitive scraping, smoke in the eyes, lifting wet hides, softening stiff materials, carrying loads, cooking while also watching children, repairing clothing because a small tear in summer becomes a serious problem in winter. These are not background chores. They are the infrastructure of sleeping without freezing. Men's labour could be costly in different ways: hunting in severe weather, travelling long distances, risking injury, locating herds or game, cutting and hauling materials, defending communities, negotiating trade and movement, and returning with enough food to make the household's inner fire possible. Again, the details varied by nation and period, but the larger point remains. Winter did not separate domestic life from survival. It braided them tightly. The hunt came home as meat, hide, bone, sinew, fat, story, obligation, and exhaustion. And sometimes the cost was emotional. A winter shelter concentrated worry. If food ran low, everyone knew. If someone was ill, there was no distant hospital wing, no private room with machines humming behind a curtain. The sick person was there, breathing near the fire, under the robe, within reach. Care was intimate because space was intimate. Fear did not have much room to hide. Yet closeness could also be consolation. A person did not have to face the dark as an isolated unit of survival. The same crowded shelter that made privacy difficult made abandonment harder. A child could be pulled closer. An elder could be watched. Someone awake could hear another person stirring. Heat moved between bodies, and so did responsibility. That is why the human cost should not be mistaken for misery alone. It was also the cost of belonging to a system where your actions mattered to other people's sleep. That can be burdensome. It can also be a form of meaning. The person who gathers fuel is not merely doing a chore, they are extending the night's safety. The person who repairs bedding is not merely maintaining an object, they are protecting future rest. The person who wakes to tend the coals is standing between the household and the hour before dawn, when the cold often feels most confident. The hour before dawn is important. Many fires have lowered by then. Bodies have been still for a long time. The first strong activity of morning has not yet begun. Hunger may be waiting. The shelter may be quiet enough that every sound outside seems larger. This is when the system's fatigue shows. If the bedding is dry and the coals are alive and the robes are still tucked, the household has made it through the most vulnerable part of the night. And nobody outside may ever know. No monument marks that success. No chronicle records that a child stayed warm, that an old person slept, that a robe held, that a seam did not fail, that someone's tired hand found the edge of the cover in darkness and closed it. But those are the victories that make a people's history continue. Not always the grand events, often the ordinary nights when no one froze. The cold writes no applause for being resisted. It simply leaves, and the people rise. The evidence becomes quieter, right where modern curiosity becomes loudest. We want to know exactly how it felt, exactly how warm the inside stayed, exactly how many degrees warmer than the outside, exactly where each person slept, how often the fire was tended, how much smoke filled the upper air, how thick the bedding was, whether a child woke twice or 5 times, whether the robe smelled more of smoke or animal fat or damp wool after trade goods entered the household. We want the past to hand us a floor plan, a temperature reading, and a diary written at 3 a.m. by someone too cold to sleep. But household history rarely gives us that kind of evidence. The public world leaves records because power likes to write things down. Treaties leave records, missionaries write reports, traders keep accounts, armies make maps, governments count, classify, order, forbid, and punish. But the inside of a winter lodge is harder to recover. Bedding wears out, boughs rot, mats decay, smoke drifts away. Hides are reused, traded, cut down, repaired, buried, lost, or carried into other lives. The most intimate technologies often survive in fragments, objects, oral knowledge, ethnographic notes, museum collections, archaeology, and the memories of descendant communities. That does not mean we know nothing. It means we have to speak with the right kind of confidence. We can say with confidence that shelter varied enormously across indigenous North America. We can say that plains tipis, woodland wigwams, earth lodges, snow houses, lean-tos, bark houses, mat-covered structures, and many other dwellings belong to different peoples, seasons, regions, and needs. We can say that insulation mattered, that sleeping surfaces mattered, that animal hides and furs could provide warmth, that fire required ventilation, that smoke was both useful and irritating, that food and fuel shaped winter comfort, and that household labour made warmth possible. What we cannot do, honestly, is pretend that one perfect diagram answers the title for everyone. That is where myth usually enters, wearing snowshoes and looking confident. One popular myth imagines indigenous people as magically immune to cold, as if their bodies were made of a different winter substance. That is not respect. It is just another way of refusing to understand the work. People felt cold. They managed cold. They suffered from cold. They developed technologies, habits, and social systems to reduce cold's power. Calling that natural toughness erases the intelligence. Another myth goes in the opposite direction and imagines every winter shelter as miserable, primitive, smoky, and barely survivable, with people huddled in helplessness until spring. That is also wrong. It mistakes unfamiliar comfort for no comfort at all. A lodge could be smoky and still intelligently designed, crowded and still safe. simple in material and sophisticated in performance, hard to live in by modern standards and fully adapted to its own world. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle, which is usually where history has hidden the good furniture. Outsider accounts are useful, but they need caution. A trader might describe a teepee or lodge because it surprised him. A missionary might describe domestic life through moral judgment. A military observer might notice camp order, movement or material conditions, while missing meanings that were obvious to the people living there. Later ethnographers sometimes recorded valuable information, but often after communities had already endured disease, displacement, land loss, missionization, boarding schools, reservation policies, resource destruction, and trade transformations. A description written in the late 19th or early 20th century may preserve older knowledge, but it may also reflect a world already violently changed. So the evidence itself has weather on it. Archaeology helps, but it has its own silences. Hearths can be found, post-molds may suggest structures, artifacts can show hide processing, tool use, food remains, trade goods, and seasonal occupation. Burn patterns and camp layouts can say something about how people lived, but archaeology is better at finding the durable than the tender. Stone survives better than fur, bone survives better than breath. A sleeping child leaves less evidence than a broken tool. This is why oral traditions and indigenous knowledge matter, not as decorative additions after the real evidence, but as forms of historical memory with their own protocols, authority, and limits. Some knowledge is shared publicly, some belongs to families, nations, ceremonial contexts, or language communities. A responsible script does not treat living cultures as an open pantry of interesting details. It listens where listening is invited and admits where the boundary should remain. Even the words we use need care. Native Americans is a modern, broad label. It can be useful in a title because viewers understand it, but it is too blunt for the actual history. The peoples of North America were, and are, many nations with their own names, languages, territories, technologies, laws, humour, and ways of making a winter night bearable. A Blackfoot teepee, an Ojibwe winter lodge, a Haudenosaunee longhouse community, an Inuit snowhouse, a Cree camp, a Mi'kmaq wigwam, and a Pueblo room in winter are not interchangeable answers to the same camping question. The cold itself was not the same everywhere either. Sub-zero cold on the northern plains is not identical to damp maritime cold in the northeast, or boreal forest cold, or Arctic coastal cold, or mountain cold. Dry cold and wet cold ask different things of clothing. Wind changes shelter, snow changes travel, tree cover changes fuel, herds, fish, stored crops and game animals change diet. A good winter system is not universal because winter is not universal. This is the part where the title becomes useful precisely because it is too simple. It pulls us in with a question that sounds like survival trivia, then it forces us to unlearn the single answer. How did they sleep? Some slept under bison robes in hide lodges with liners and smoke flaps. Some slept on bough-covered floors in bark or mat-covered dwellings. Some used raised sleeping areas. Some relied on furs, woven mats, shared warmth, stored foods, and carefully managed hearths. Some adapted with trade blankets, canvas, metal tools, and later stoves under changing historical pressure. Some endured nights that were still bitter and dangerous despite every skill available. The answer is not one method. It is a pattern of thought. Do not let the ground steal heat. Do not let wind move freely across sleeping bodies. Do not let bedding stay damp. Do not waste fuel. Do not ignore smoke. Do not sleep hungry if food is available. Do not treat a child's uncovered body as a small problem. Do not assume the fire will solve what insulation should solve. Do not imagine comfort begins at bedtime. Build the night all day. That last line may be the closest we get to a universal principle. Build the night all day. The evidence supports that more than it supports any single romantic image. It shows us materials gathered before dark, hides processed long before winter, food stored before scarcity, shelter forms shaped by generations, family roles learned through repetition, and designs adjusted to local weather. It shows us that sleeping warm was the final result of a chain of decisions, not a lucky accident after sunset. And because the evidence is incomplete, the best history here is not less vivid, it is more careful. It says, here is what we know, here is what likely varied, here is what outsiders misunderstood, here is what should not be claimed too broadly. Here is where the silence of the record is not emptiness, but a reminder that ordinary life often kept its deepest knowledge close to the people who lived it. The smoke rises, the robe decays, the boughs return to soil. But the pattern remains visible, if we look patiently enough. By the time the old winter systems meet the modern world, they are often misunderstood twice. First, they are underestimated. A person sees a hide lodge or a bark-covered dwelling in a museum image, compares it to a heated house, and thinks mostly about what is missing. No furnace, no thick glass windows, no foam insulation, no electric blanket with 3 settings and a mysterious 4th setting that feels like being gently cooked by a hotel. From that angle, the shelter looks poor because it does not resemble modern comfort. Then, just as often, the system is over-romanticized. The same person swings too far the other way and imagines pure harmony with nature, perfect resilience, everyone warm by instinct, every winter night transformed into a soft painting of smoke, stars, and wisdom. That version feels kinder, but it is still not accurate. It removes labour. It removes hunger. It removes illness, exhaustion, gendered work, colonial disruption, bad weather. And the simple fact that people in the past were not living inside our need for them to be inspiring. The more useful modern echo is neither pity nor fantasy. It is respect for systems thinking. Because the Winter Lodge teaches something modern houses often hide. Comfort is not a single invention. It is a chain of relationships. In a modern home, warmth may seem to come from a thermostat, but the thermostat is just the visible button on a vast invisible machine. Behind it are fuel systems, power lines, insulation industries, construction codes, extraction economies, repair workers, monthly bills, and climate consequences that usually remain outside the bedroom door. We say, I turned up the heat, as if heat were a small, obedient pet living in the wall. Older winter shelters made fewer illusions available. If there was warmth, someone could point to its sources: the robe, the fire, the boughs, the food, the seam, the smoke flap, the person who repaired the cover, the person who gathered fuel, the person who taught the child not to leave the door open. Comfort was not hidden inside infrastructure. Comfort was infrastructure, visible in the room. That does not make the old way morally purer. It makes it more legible. Modern life has not escaped dependence. It has outsourced the feeling of dependence. We no longer smell the fuel most of the time. We do not scrape the hide. We do not usually gather the bedding from the forest floor. We do not wake to adjust smoke flaps when the wind changes. But our warmth still comes from somewhere, and it still costs something. It is just that the cost arrives as a bill, a pipeline, a power plant, a supply chain, a damaged landscape, or a repair appointment scheduled between noon and 5 by a company that apparently believes time is a myth. There is a dark little joke there, but also a serious one. We are not less dependent than the people in the Winter Lodge. We are dependent at a greater distance. That distance changes memory. When warmth is automatic, the body forgets its teachers. It forgets that dry feet matter, that the ground steals heat, that food is part of warmth, that dampness is dangerous, that small drafts become large problems over time, that a household is a thermal community whether it admits it or not. A person sleeping alone in a heated apartment still relies on countless unseen hands, but the room does not make that obvious. The old shelter did. This is why the legacy of Indigenous winter architecture should not be reduced to survival tips. It is tempting for modern audiences to turn the subject into a list: use layers, insulate the ground, manage ventilation, eat enough calories, stay dry. Those points are true enough in broad principle, but if we stop there, we shrink a whole world into camping advice. The deeper legacy is cultural intelligence under constraint. It is the ability to build a livable night from local materials, inherited knowledge, social cooperation, and close attention to the body. And that intelligence did not disappear into the past. Indigenous peoples are not historical props sealed inside winter scenes. They are living nations, families, artists, scholars, language keepers, hunters, builders, activists, and communities whose relationships to land and winter continue in many forms. Some traditional practices survive, some have been revived, some have changed, and some were violently interrupted by colonial policies that tried to separate people from land, language, mobility, food systems, and household knowledge. That matters because a shelter is never just shelter. It is a way of knowing where you are. Forced settlement, reservation policies, boarding schools, missionization, bans or pressures against cultural practices, land dispossession, and the destruction of animal resources did not merely change where people slept. They attacked the systems that made older forms of sleeping meaningful and possible. When a people loses access to a seasonal route, a hunting ground, a stand of usable trees, a herd, a language of weather, or the elders who teach household practice, the loss is not abstract. It can be felt in the bed, the meal, the wall, the winter coat, the child's knowledge of what to do when the cold arrives. The modern echo, then, carries grief. But it also carries persistence. Museum collections, oral histories, community education, cultural camps, language revitalization, land-based learning, and Indigenous scholarship all remind us that these were not vanished tricks from a vanished world. They are parts of continuing histories, though not always available for outsiders to consume. Some knowledge is shared publicly, some is protected, some belongs inside communities. Respect means accepting that not every warm thing is ours to handle. From a YouTube distance, it is easy to ask, how did they do it? As if the answer should be placed neatly in our hands. But some of the better answer is a change in posture. Less grabbing, more listening. Less, what is the hack? More, what kind of world made this knowledge necessary, and what happened when that world was attacked? The title began with sleep, which seems private. By now, sleep has opened into ecology, labour, gender, childhood, architecture, colonial history, food, fuel, trade, and memory. That is what ordinary life does when you follow it far enough. A bed becomes a map, a blanket becomes an economy, a draft becomes evidence, a fire becomes politics. The small room turns out to contain the whole world, only folded tightly so people can survive the night. And maybe that is why the image stays with us. Not because it is quaint, and not because it is miserable, but because it is honest. A winter shelter under a dark sky tells the truth about human life, in a way modern comfort often disguises. We are soft animals. We need heat. We need food. We need each other more than we like to admit. We build systems around our vulnerable bodies, and then, if the systems work well enough, we forget how vulnerable we are. The old winter lodge did not let anyone forget for long. It taught through smoke, through cold feet, through the weight of robes, through the sound of wind testing the cover, through the relief of coals still alive before dawn. Its lesson was not that people were tougher in the past. The lesson was that warmth is a relationship, and relationships require tending. Outside, the winter keeps moving. Inside, someone tends. By the time the final insight begins to gather, the shelter is no longer just an object in the snow. It has become a way of seeing. At first, the questions seemed to belong to survival. How did people sleep without freezing? What materials did they use? How did the fire work? What kept the wind out? Those questions matter, and they have practical answers. Hides, robes, boughs, mats, bark, liners, smoke holes, food, fuel, clothing, family, and skill. But the longer we stay with the scene, the less satisfying a list becomes. A list can tell us what was in the room. It cannot tell us why the room worked. The room worked because everyone inside understood that warmth was temporary. That may be the deepest difference between their winter world and ours. Modern comfort encourages us to think of warmth as a setting. You choose it, and then complain if it drifts 2 degrees away from your preference. But in the winter shelter, warmth was more like a guest. It had to be invited, fed, protected, watched, and persuaded not to leave too early. If neglected, it slipped out through the roof, crawled under the door, flattened into damp bedding, or died down among the coals before morning. So the household learned not to assume it. That one idea explains almost everything. It explains why the floor mattered. It explains why a robe was valuable. It explains why the fire could not simply be made enormous and left to solve the night. It explains why smoke had to be managed, why airflow had to be understood, why children had to be tucked in, why food mattered before sleep, why dampness was dangerous, why repairs could not wait forever, why the shape of a shelter mattered less as an isolated design and more as part of a living practice. Warmth was not possessed, it was maintained. A tipi in winter, when well made and well managed, was not trying to become a European house. A wigwam was not trying to become a cabin. A snow-adapted northern shelter was not trying to become a symbol for someone else's imagination. Each dwelling answered its own problem in its own place. The mistake is to rank them by resemblance to modern buildings. That is like judging a canoe by how poorly it performs as a staircase. The correct question is not, was this house advanced? The correct question is, advanced for what? Advanced for movement, advanced for repair, advanced for available materials, advanced for smoke and flame inside a room, advanced for a family that needed to sleep, cook, store, teach, and survive in the same space. Advanced for a world where animals, weather, tools, memory, and kinship all had to cooperate. The winter shelter was not a primitive version of our house. It was a precise answer to a different set of demands. And it was precise in ways easy to miss. A liner is a quiet precision. A bough floor is a quiet precision. A robe hair side in or out, depending on use and weather, is a quiet precision. Door placement, edge weighting, smoke flap adjustment, fuel choice, bedding location, and the order of nighttime chores are all quiet precision. None of it shouts, none of it asks to be admired by people centuries later. It simply keeps the child from waking cold. That may be why it feels so moving when understood properly. The old winter shelter does not only show human endurance, it shows care made practical. Love, in this setting, could look like a repaired seam. It could look like saving the better robe for someone weaker. It could look like banking the coals. It could look like teaching a child not to waste heat. It could look like scraping a hide until the hands ached because winter would come whether the work was finished or not. We often prefer love when it appears as a grand statement. History more often preserves it as maintenance. The danger in telling this story is making it too clean. If we polish it too much, the shelter becomes a glowing little snow globe of indigenous wisdom, and that is not fair. It turns real people into decorative ancestors for a modern audience that wants meaning without discomfort. But if we darken it too much, it becomes only misery, smoke, cold, hunger, and suffering, which is also false. Human beings are very good at making life inside difficulty. They make jokes there. They make songs there. They make etiquette, irritation, tenderness, rivalry, pride, and bedtime. The truth is not in choosing between hardship and beauty. The truth is that both were in the room. The robe was warm, and it was work. The fire was comfort, and it was smoke. The closeness of family was safety, and it was crowding. The portable shelter was freedom, and it was labour. The animal gave food and warmth, and its absence could become catastrophe. The knowledge was powerful, and it could still be overwhelmed by illness, scarcity, colonial violence, or weather beyond ordinary preparation. A real history can hold all of that without forcing one feeling to defeat the others. So when we look back at the original image, the sub-zero tent under the winter sky, it should no longer look impossible. But it should not look easy either. It should look inhabited by effort. The hide cover is not just a cover. It is hunting, tanning, sewing, ownership, repair, and memory. The smoke hole is not just a picturesque opening. It is a problem solved poorly or well every night. The bedding is not just bedding. It is ground insulation, animal warmth, family wealth, and the difference between rest and shivering. The fire is not just fire. It is fuel gathered before dark, air moving correctly, sparks watched carefully, food cooked, dampness driven away, and coals hoped for before dawn. Everything visible is the surface of something invisible. That is the changed perception the story leaves behind. The shelter did not sit between people and nature like a wall. It connected them to nature in controlled, practical ways. Tree became pole, bark became wall, grass became mat, animal became robe, fire became centre, food became body heat, snow became both threat and possible insulation. Wind became an enemy that could sometimes be guided but never fully trusted. The whole home was a conversation with the surrounding world. Modern comfort often dreams of separation. Seal the house, shut the window, close the door, keep nature outside. But many older winter systems survived through relationship rather than denial. They did not pretend the outside world was gone. They let it enter in useful forms and kept out the parts that killed sleep. That is a subtle art, more subtle than simply building thicker walls. The final insight is not that we should all return to sleeping under hides in sub-zero weather. That would be a strange conclusion, and most people would abandon it around the moment their feet began negotiating surrender. The insight is that comfort has a history, and that history is full of intelligence we barely notice because it served ordinary bodies rather than monuments. A warm night is one of civilization's oldest achievements. Not a palace, not a crown, not a written law. A warm night, a child sleeping through wind, an elder waking with breath still steady. A household rising after bitter cold because the seams held, the fire lasted, the bedding stayed dry enough, and someone cared before the danger became visible. That is not a small thing. It is the quiet foundation under everything else people do. No songs, no councils, no hunts, no ceremonies, no journeys, no stories, no future, unless bodies make it through the night. The winter shelter protected that fragile beginning. It guarded the plain animal fact beneath culture. People must wake up tomorrow. And in the dark, under hides and smoke and handmade warmth, they did. And so the final image should not be a heroic one. Not a lone figure standing against a blizzard, not a perfect lodge glowing in the snow as if winter has been kindly arranged for a painting, not a fantasy of people untouched by cold, hunger, smoke, pain, or exhaustion. The better image is smaller than that, quieter, a shelter at the edge of night, the fire low, the robes pulled close, the wind still trying the seams. Someone awake when others are asleep, listening not because they are afraid of everything, but because they know what deserves attention. That is the part modern comfort makes easy to forget. Safety often looks boring from the outside. It looks like a tied flap, a dry mat, a patched place in the cover, a child turned back under the robe, a coal kept alive, a meal eaten before the body had to face the long, cold hours. Nothing dramatic enough for a monument, everything important enough for survival. The people in those winter shelters did not sleep warm because winter was less dangerous then. They did not sleep warm because they possessed some mythical immunity to cold, as if history had issued stronger bodies to earlier generations and then discontinued the model. They slept when they slept well because warmth had been assembled around them from many directions. From animals, trees, fire, food, labour, kinship, memory and design. From the land itself, transformed by knowledge into something a body could rest inside. A bison robe was not only a blanket, it was grass turned into animal, animal turned into hide, hide turned into household survival. A pole was not only a pole, it was a tree, chosen, cut, carried, placed at the correct angle, and trusted under weather. A smoke hole was not only an opening, it was the difference between breathing and choking, between keeping heat and losing it. A floor of boughs was not only rough bedding, it was air trapped under tired bones. A fire was not simply warmth. It was fuel gathered earlier, smoke negotiated now, and ash waiting by morning. Everything had a past before it became comfort. That may be the memory line of the whole story. Everything warm had a history. And if we hold that line gently, it changes the way the shelter looks. The winter lodge stops being a strange object from a distant past and becomes a concentrated form of human dependence. Everyone has always lived inside systems. Some systems are made of hide and smoke and boughs. Some are made of wires, furnaces, pipes, bills, mines, roads, repair workers, and power grids. The difference is not dependence or independence. The difference is whether the system is visible enough to teach humility. Inside the older shelter, humility was difficult to avoid. The wind reminded you. The smoke reminded you. The ground reminded you. Damp clothing reminded you with particular cruelty. If you wasted heat, you felt it. If you ignored a draft, someone slept badly. If you failed to prepare, the night explained the mistake without needing to raise its voice. That does not mean the past was wiser in every way. It means certain kinds of wisdom were harder to escape. A person living close to the cold learned that comfort is not the natural state of the world. Comfort is an achievement, often temporary, often shared, often built by someone whose work becomes invisible only after it succeeds. This is why the story should leave us with respect, but not romance. Respect sees the skill. Romance tries to erase the cost. Respect notices the women's hands that made the coverings, the hunter's exhaustion, the elder's memory, the children's vulnerability, the smoke in everyone's eyes, the winter hunger, the cold that still sometimes won. Respect also notices the laughter, the stories, the glow of coals, the relief of dry bedding, the ordinary miracle of waking with warmth still held around the body. The truth is not that these winter homes were miserable. The truth is not that they were cozy in some effortless storybook way. The truth is better and harder. They were livable because people made them livable. And livability is one of the great human arts. We tend to give our admiration to the spectacular arts, the carved mask, the tainted hide, the ceremonial object, the weapon, the monument, the song remembered for generations. But there is another art beneath them, quieter and older, the art of arranging a night so the body survives it, the art of knowing where to place the bedding, the art of keeping the fire useful instead of dangerous, the art of letting air move without letting warmth escape too quickly, the art of turning animal bodies, plant bodies, and human labour into rest. No culture continues without that art. Before any great speech, before any journey, before any treaty, before any harvest, before any ceremony, before any story told to children, someone has to make it through the night. History stands on mornings, and mornings are not guaranteed. They are earned, one protected sleep at a time. So perhaps the original question has one final answer, and it is not a trick answer. How did Native Americans sleep in sub-zero winter tents without freezing? They did it by refusing to treat sleep as separate from life. The day prepared the night. The hunt prepared the robe. The forest prepared the floor. The meal prepared the body. The family prepared the warmth. The shelter prepared the air. The elders prepared the knowledge. The hands prepared what the cold would test. The bed was the last step, not the first. That is the perception worth carrying away. When we see a winter shelter now, we should not see a thin wall between life and death and wonder how anyone survived. We should see a whole world folded inward, a world of materials chosen carefully, work done repeatedly, relationships maintained, dangers noticed early, and comfort made with no promise that it would last unless people kept tending it. The final scene is almost still. Outside, the snow holds the dark. The wind moves over the land, across trees or grass or frozen open ground, looking for every loose edge. The shelter answers softly, not with defiance, not with conquest, with arrangement, with hide against pole, robe against body, coal under ash, bough under bedding, smoke finding its path upward, and human beings lying close enough for warmth to become shared. By morning, the fire may be low, the air may be cold near the floor, someone's eyes may sting from smoke, someone may wake stiff, someone may have slept badly. But if the system held, if the seams stayed firm enough, if the bedding stayed dry enough, if the coals lived long enough, if the child remained covered and the elder kept warm, then the night has been answered. No one outside applauds. The shelter does not ask them to. It simply lets the people wake. And that, in the end, is the quiet genius of it. Warmth was not something waiting inside the tent. Warmth was made there, guarded there, shared there, and made again before dawn.